Bias gets a bad rap in machine learning, and yet the whole point of a machine learning model is that it biases certain inputs to certain outputs. A picture of a cat to a label that says cat, for example. So removing bias from AI just isn't in the cards. Instead, we need to think about which biases are acceptable and how extreme they can be. These are questions that call for a mix of technical and philosophical insight that's really hard to find, but luckily, I managed to do just that by inviting onto the podcast none other than Margaret Mitchell, a former senior research scientist in Google's Research and Machine Intelligence Research Group, whose work has been focused on practical AI ethics. And by practical, I really do mean the nuts and bolts of how AI ethics can be baked into real systems and navigating the complex moral issues that come up where the AI rubber meets the social road. That's a bad metaphor, but anyway, Margaret joined me to talk about her thinking on AI ethics and what she sees as the most important challenges in AI fairness and bias on this episode of the Towards Data Science podcast. Your experience is like really wide-ranging, Google, Microsoft, and now you're kind of doing your own thing as I understand it. So I'd love to dive into what brought you to this space.
Well, I guess I would say that since 2005, I was working on assistive and augmentative technology, technology for people who are neurotypical, things like trying to automatically diagnose mild cognitive impairment, which is a precursor to Alzheimer's. So I continued this thread throughout my work in computational linguistics and machine learning on how to create technology that's good and useful for people. I ended up writing my thesis on vision to language, so taking the visual stream and describing it in some way. And I sort of hit this point as I started to see it work, started to see these flashes of the future and what the future would look like, where instead of getting excited, I was like, oh no, this is very bad, because I saw the mistakes it was making. I saw that it was picking up all these different kinds of problems from the data set. And so instead of having that moment of excitement that I think a lot of people tend to have when their numbers are increasing, they're, beating the blue score or whatever, my moment was more like terror, because I saw how quickly we were advancing the technology and how much we were not really thinking about the long-term uses and what will happen with it.
Could you provide some examples of those failure modes that kind of got you thinking down this line early on?
Yeah, well, I would say that the moment that was really the largest switch for me was I was working on automatic storytelling generation. So this was a project I had done at Microsoft Research, working with a bunch of really great people. And I had given it a sequence of images of someone looking out the window and seeing a massive explosion. And then you see that there is on the TV screen, like sort of in the foreground, a headline about the Hempstead blast. And then slightly behind it, looking out the window, is the actual blast. So this person is like clearly very close to where this, horrible, life-changing emergency is happening, and videotaping it or taking pictures. And so I sent it to the computer, to the AI, as you might say, to see what it thought about it. And it said, like, this is great. This is an awesome view. It was like, I mean, it is a good view for seeing what's happening, but in terms of mortality and human risk, like, that is not the first reaction I want you to have. And so it just sort of really struck me, like, how surface level a lot of the understanding is, and how that means that, like, once we start having AI, being able to make its own actions and choices, if it thinks that a massive explosion is beautiful, especially a massive explosion at a workplace, then maybe we're not moving in exactly the right path.
And this was pre-deep learning, right? I mean, this would have been, you were saying
it was right at the switch. Yeah. So my PhD thesis had been working with pre-deep learning computer vision systems, which largely didn't work. And then right around the time I started at Microsoft, it was around 2011, 2012, when we saw really the flourishing of deep learning and how well it was working for computer vision. So I was working on image captioning throughout it. It was around 2012 that we were doing the first systems on deep learning based image captioning. And so it was around 2013 for the storytelling deep learning sort of generation of stories.
And was there a brief period where you had a flicker of hope that maybe deep learning, because it was more powerful, more capable of dealing with vision data, that it might not have the same failure modes? Or were you basically just like, I know this is going to be a problem already, like I don't need to see the increased capabilities or to see how, I know there are going to be failure modes in this direction, in other words?
So the storytelling thing was with deep learning, and that
Oh, I'm
was
sorry.
part,
Okay.
yeah, and that was part of what was so, I think, like terrifying about it, was because, I had been working previously on natural language generation, where the idea was that you have some semantic form and you're generating from some semantic form. So you have a lot of control over what's happening and what the system is saying. In this case, you don't really have control. You just sort of give it these encodings and embeddings, and it's not exactly transparent, like what this means semantically. And so since that was quickly becoming the state of the art and what it was picking up was a bit opaque, the fact that it started generating, potentially life-threatening / murderous ideas was really terrifying to me.
And did the kinds of failures that you saw from these systems evolve as deep learning, as neural networks got bigger, as the technology got more and more layered on top of itself?
Yeah, I don't know how much it evolved versus how much I was just peering into it more and more and discovering more and more. And I think the public has done that too over the past few years, right? So like, maybe 10 years ago, it was really exciting when a computer vision system could recognize a bird as a bird. And then, just maybe a few weeks ago, there was news about Facebook calling Black people primates, and that, everyone's paying attention to that and what that bias means and stuff like that. But I mean, that's that's news that a lot of us knew about, maybe 9 years ago. As we sort of dug into the different kinds of errors, we developed more robust evaluation techniques. And so really, over time, it was just more understanding how to evaluate in terms of different foreseeable harms. And I think that's, the sort of fairness and ethics world has done a fairly good job at maturing, those sort of processes, while I think, at large in the public, it's still like exciting and horrifying discoveries as these things happen that haven't been appropriately tested for.
That's actually really interesting because it aligns with a conversation I had with Andy Jones. Andy Jones, who's at Anthropic now, where we were talking about meta learning in that case, and how to him, in retrospect, GPT-3, GPT-2, these things were not the first meta learners. In fact, once you've seen an obvious meta learner, you can kind of go back and look at older systems and say, hey, you know what? Like, we can apply a bit of a reductionist lens and say, actually, that behavior, that's in hindsight like this obvious kind of precursor to this stuff. It's interesting that this happens then in ethics too. Like, would you agree with that comparison?
I think that with sort of ethics and fairness, yeah, a lot of the focus has been on evaluation specifically, and looking at how the systems perform differently in different sort of evaluation tasks. So I suppose that's somewhat comparable.
Do you think that's cause for optimism then, like looking forward and saying, hey, well, hopefully some of the problems won't change that much in kind of qualitative terms?
The problems, okay, yeah. So I would love to say, I would love to be optimistic about this and hopeful. And I I generally am a little bit pessimistic, so I want to try and turn that around in some way. But um, I would say that even when we are able to predict the kinds of errors that are likely to be made, or problematic outputs that are likely to be created, understanding how to stop them from happening in the first place is really tricky. And even when we do understand it, it can't really be solved, at least fully. And so it's going to take a lot of years before we can get to a point where we can start addressing even some of the basic issues that we see now, like representation in data.
Okay, well, maybe this is a good segue then into your day-to-day to understand the nuts and bolts of some of these issues. So actually, with that, maybe that's my question. What's your day-to-day look like? Like, who do you work with? What kinds of problems do you tend to focus on? What does that look like? The day in the life of an AI ethicist.
Well, I'm a computer scientist. I
Oh, I'm sorry.
practice ethics. Yeah. I feel like, I love to be promoted to being an ethicist, but it's probably a little bit offensive to actual ethicists. Yeah, I mean, my background is in computer science, but, I've always tried to incorporate the sort of like forward thinking about AI for good and bias and stuff. But anywho, the day in life right now is very different every day, because I am not working full time anywhere in particular. I'll be starting at Hugging Face full time probably around the 1st of November. But until then, I've been working as a contractor consultant, including at Hugging Face, but also working with a few other companies and governments. And so my day is hopping around between a lot of different topics and a lot of sort of different context switches, working on everything from how to do inclusive hiring and performance reviews to how to best fit observed language to a Zipfian distribution, to how to code up some things that people will find really understandable and be able to do themselves, to talking about regulatory ideas and things like that. So right now it's pretty crazy. I just do a lot of context switches all day. I take time to go to my garden. That's like my calming place where I can sort of center myself. I hop in and out all day, which is one nice thing about working from home. You could quickly go out for a prune, go prune a couple things and come back. But yeah, it's very much hopping around, and also weird times. Sometimes you have to be up at like 3 a.m. or something for a conference in Europe. So yeah, it's a bit chaotic and scattered, but I'm having a lot of fun doing it.
Yeah, we were just talking about before we started recording, your sort of sleep schedule being disrupted because of all the international stuff, which
I
is
definitely complain about 9 a.m. meetings. That's a theme throughout my life. Yeah.
I think you're very entitled to it. Yeah, more so than others. One thing I'd love to ask about then is when you, because you have this bird's eye view of the field of not just AI generally, but you focus so much on ethics. What are the biggest sources of, let's say, ethical problems in the development of AI today from your standpoint?
Yeah, the biggest source is inclusion. And that's, I think, a bummer to hear for a lot of computer scientists, because it doesn't have a lot to do with the implementation of computer science. It has to do with the culture around it. But I think everyone who's worked heavily in this sort of ethics fairness space has come to basically the same conclusion, which is that if you're trying to trace back the roots of all the issues, you come to who's at the table at the start. And it turns out that even if you can get a lot of people from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different genders, what we call diversity, there's still not environments of inclusion where people with different characteristics feel comfortable to talk about what they're saying, feel welcomed, and don't feel alienated. And so even when you have diverse people at the table, you still have the same people making the decisions, right? And so, as much as we can work on things like data and optimization functions and evaluation and things like that, the core of everything that's being decided from the beginning is who's at the table, who's talking about the ideas, who has the foresight to talk through what different projects might do or might not do. And we are not able to have a really good view of that because we're failing across the board at inclusion. Even if we can hire diverse candidates, we're failing to include.
So this might lead to something that you talk about on a video in your website that I watched and found really interesting. You talked about this idea of a view of the machine learning pipeline through the lens of bias. And I assume, correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume that you're talking here about This first piece being kind of the first part of that pipeline. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, so some people talk about it as a pipeline. I think probably like my colleagues at Microsoft talk about it as a life cycle a lot. I like to talk about it as a life cycle as well, because there are people involved throughout the whole process, and then also in monitoring and responding to different sorts of issues and updating. So where there are people, there are inclusion issues. But to any start of a pipeline or life cycle, the inclusion is of utmost importance. So you can slice and dice the machine learning life cycle in a few different ways. One of the ways that I like to do it in terms of is in terms of first the data collection, second the training, third the generation of the results, and then fourth the people acting on it, the sort of behaviors that are evoked from the outputs of these systems. And it turns out that, by this kind of four-way split, it's really easy to see all the various ways that different kinds of human biases come in. So at the data collection stage, you have biases in the data. So, people are racist and sexist. That's not, I think, a surprise to anyone. People are ableist, things like this. And they reflect that in what they write. And the data that we're using scrapes this information and learns from it. So, for example, it turns out that Reddit is fairly highly represented in some data sets. There's a new data set that came out that was largely Wikipedia. And, Wikipedia is mostly college educated single white men, which translates to there being no African history. And actually, like, if you look up like African American history, it like redirects to Black history or something like that, right? So it's like areas these people don't know anything about, or might even have negative derogatory statements about. That's in the data. The system learns that. And then the annotation. So that's even before we get to training, right? But in the processing of the data, how we curated it, and then the kinds of notes we get on it when we're giving it to the system to learn from, those are all, filled with the biases of the annotators and the curators and things like that. And now you get to training, and then it comes to, your choice of objective function and the way you want to evaluate it as you go, and what you consider success, if you're going to look at it in terms of an aggregate score or disaggregated across a variety of subpopulations, and which way is better. I think the standard right now is to say the aggregate score, but I think a lot of us in the sort of ethics realm are trying to say the disaggregated scores.
Could you unpack that a little bit? Like, what do you mean by aggregated and disaggregated scores?
Right. Yeah. So I think like sort of like general audience understanding of AI is that you like train a system and you look at its accuracy. Like, what is it accurate? What is its accuracy? You want to get to 100%. 100% is good, like 0% is bad. I think that's sort of a basic understanding. And then I guess sort of, well, I can go farther than that, but I'll take a step back to answer your question more directly. So that would be an aggregate statistic where it's just one number for all of the data, and that's your accuracy. Another way to do it is to say, okay, in my data, I have people who are under 18. I have people who are between 18 and 35. I have people, 35 to whatever, and have these sort of buckets of these different ages. So what we're doing there is we're defining a characteristic, specifically age, and we are defining the subpopulations within those. So like young and old. And then we're looking at what you might call accuracy for each of these groups. So instead of having one accuracy number, we're basically saying like, what's the accuracy for people who are younger? What's the accuracy for people who are older? And that's disaggregated. And the idea here is that if you choose the characteristics and subpopulations in light of power differentials in society, so for example, ageism is a serious issue, right? People will tend to be a little bit more will talk down more to people who are older, right? That's ageism, or not pay attention to people who are older. That's ageism. So this is sort of a power differential. By being aware of that in society and then defining your evaluation protocol in light of that, you can start looking at whether your system is reflecting these same kinds of differentials, where the system might work better for others and less well for some people from how you've trained it. So that's the basic, like, aggregated versus disaggregated. I don't know if that's confusing or if that's.
Yeah, no, I think it's very clarifying. I think it's also the sort of at the crux of at least one major kind of cluster of questions that, at least to me, come up in the context of AI ethics. And it's like, so you look at, I think age is a great example, because it's this continuous variable that in principle, you could keep slicing and dicing. So in essence, like, I guess part of my question would be, is AI ethics a fractal problem? In other words,
oh my God, yes, it is. We literally call it that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's so funny. When me and my colleagues at Google were starting up all the fairness work, eventually became sort of its own org, we got into this problem. We called it the fractal problem.
Oh,
and
wow.
then there was an argument about whether you should call it an infinite onion or a fractal. Personally, I was a proponent of the fractal problem.
I have to ask, what are the two camps here? What's the onion camp and the fractal?
Well, infinite onion is that as you peel back layers, you just find more and more layers, and it's a good band name. So it has that going for it. That's fair. Whereas fractal problem isn't as, such a good band name, maybe like a postmodern, I don't know. But it gets at this idea of, when you look at a problem, the more deeply you dive into it, the more it expands in complexity as you look at it. And so it can be hard to make even the most basic progress, because there's no point you can stick and say, here, this is solved. Any point expands into further complexities.
Mm-hmm.
So part of the hardest part of operationalizing AI ethics is being able to navigate this fractal problem. I'm really excited that you independently brought that up. That's like completely a theme in all of this work.
Oh, I'm glad to hear I'm not out to lunch. At least my lunch is going to be an onion, apparently. So because to my mind, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm looking at this differently, but like, take age for example. You bucket, and then you say, okay, well, now we have a bucket that's 18 to 21, and then you go, okay, well, wait a minute, well, within this bucket, are we is there a bias towards 21-year-olds versus 18-year-olds, and now we subdivide. So how do you think through those layers of the onion, so to speak? Like, how do you just decide, okay, this far, and like, that's good enough, that's what we have the resources for?
Yep. At some point, I mean, you do have to draw that line because of the infinite recursion. But I mean, like, what you're getting at is exactly right. These are exactly the kind of discussions that need to happen during development, which means you need to have people who are able to speak to these issues at the table during development. I mean, practically speaking, it comes down to how much data you have. So if you want to get a reliable estimate of accuracy, I'm saying that in scare quotes, because that's not exactly the metric people use, but
optimization objective.
Generally people understand accuracy as meaning like performance metric. If you only have a few data instances, then you're not going to get a reliable estimate. And so you can't slice and dice that far, or else you're not actually going to be able to have reasonable estimates. And so that is like an actual limiter on how much you can dive into the different subgroups. I
actually wonder if there's like more zoomed out. There's always a question of how much bias is going to be acceptable, because there's going to be some amount of bias that we'll have to live with.
Absolutely.
So how do we make that trade-off when the algorithm can deliver value?
Such a good question. So I mean, the answer is that there isn't some absolute number that everyone agrees that this is a fairness point, right? But you're right in practice that you're not going to have full equality in quote unquote accuracy across all the different groups, nor necessarily exactly comparable data. So what do? I think we're at a point now that's not unlike the definition of the p-value and p-value alpha numbers. So for anyone who's familiar with statistical testing, you often will say that you You'll say that it's significant results if the p-value is less than 0.05 or 0.01 or 0.001. And those aren't, there's nothing magic about those numbers. They're just sort of numbers that make some sort of sense to say, like, okay, it's very unlikely this happened randomly. And so we'll just say that these are where we draw the lines. And it's a very similar moment right now in terms of disparities, where the question is, what level of disparity is okay? And so, for example, for face detection, I worked on releasing this transparent documentation called model cards, slice and dice, and all these different subgroups. And in order to release it, we had to say, like, what is okay to release? And so I just sort of said, it has to be within 3% recall. I mean, that is a random number, but we have to start somewhere, right? Yeah. And the 1% seems like it's actually quite hard to achieve. 5% is maybe more like what you would get with a somewhat balanced data set. So 3% is maybe sort of that sweet spot of getting to an ideal. Yeah. that's within range. But again, it's like defining a p-value. You just sort of like come up with a number and then see, do other people agree that this is where we can draw the line? Are we all good with this? Okay, well, we'll go with that. So we're at that point now where people are just starting to try and decide where to draw the line. And my consulting put forward has been 3%.
But I mean, when faced with a continuum, right? You've got to draw the line somewhere, otherwise you don't do anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So one thing I'm wondering about too in this context, so I spoke to Joaquin Quinonero Candela, who is the head of fairness research at Facebook.
He's wonderful. He's really cool.
One of the things I found really interesting about his approach was he referred to kind of fairness being a process. And so rather than trying to define any kind of metric that's just like, this is the fairness metric and I don't need to know anything else, just hit this benchmark, it was more about generating these sort of artifacts of the process of trying to reason about the ethical implications of a system. Is that what does the fairness process look like to you in a healthy organization?
So I agree with him in spirit. In practice, I think I might be, or I am a bit more pedantic. So it's useful to make a distinction between fairness metrics and ethics more broadly. And I could dig into what that means. With fairness metrics, it's not the case for people who actually work on this stuff that one metric is good enough. And I can go on my soapbox about that as well. So this idea that there's only one fairness metric to use and we have to find the right one that's not a real thing, unless you don't understand maybe. So that's kind of, I mean, probably he was like oversimplifying to talk about.
I'm sure he was, yeah.
Yeah, to talk about the difference between metrics and then the overall development life cycle, which is a very important distinction to make and one I make as well. But when I talk about the overall development life cycle, I tend to couch it more within ethics and ethical values. So not just fairness, but also justice, right? And also diversity and also inclusion and also accountability. And it brings in all these other things. And when you want to have something like transparency and accountability, that's when you get into these frameworks where you produce artifacts throughout the development process in order for those artifacts to be analyzed and evaluated when making further decisions, to trace back different previous decisions to their sources. And
like an audit trail type thing.
Yeah, it's an audit trail. Exactly right. And, there's currently no norm for that in machine learning or AI development. And so, this is something I've been publishing on, something that a lot of really cool people have been publishing on, and how to make these kinds of auditable trails. And so even if you can't be down in the weeds of the nitty gritty of, what's happening with the data collection or the training, you can see the corresponding artifact and make informed decisions based on those artifacts. Yeah.
You're deploying a very broad ethical lens on this problem. Like you're looking at this from the context of society, of technical issues and so on. What are some of the biases that you would imagine the AI ethics community and then the technical, what I'll call the technical ethics community, might itself have today in light of, let's say, geography or composition? Like,
I mean, I have blind spots in everything that has to do with not being a white female Californian Pacific Northwesterner. Uh, and so I think like acknowledging that is something that I have to do all the time, that people should do all the time working in the space, right? Like I have no clue what it's like to have the experience of a Black woman. I have no clue what it's like to have the experience of, a Latinx older man, and so by trying to make decisions about what I think that would be like, I'm probably going to put in my own biases, my own stereotypes, the things that I've learned through media, through our culture, the norms that we all learn and these stereotypes and things. And they'll sneak in implicitly and influence the decisions we make. And so anything outside of your own lived experiences, you have to realize like you have complete blind spots. You really don't know at all. And so that's part of why it's so important to create inclusive environments. Sorry to keep harping on this idea, but
no, it makes sense. I think it's also like one interesting dimension of this, and I'm still trying to figure out like how I think about it. But you hear a lot of talk about the concern over like political polarization in tech, and in California and so on, like pretty blue state, for example, and there's like a bunch of anxious conservatives worried about what's going on at Facebook. That's been very high profile, and Google, etc. Like how do you think about that, sort of those more, I guess, not esoteric, but more abstract identities, if you will, things that aren't visible, but that nonetheless might factor into this, that are harder as well to recruit for? Because it's not like you can just be like, hey, we're looking for vegan Buddhists who
right.
Like this is really right. difficult to do.
And then you also get into the tokenism problem when you do that, right? You're not hiring for the skill, you're hiring for the characteristics or whatever. Yeah, I mean, it's really important to look at the kind of work that people have output and how well thought out that is, whether or not you agree with it. But if it's incorporating good reasoning. So I'm a researcher, so a lot of the people who I end up hiring and working with have publication trails, which helps me understand like what how analytical this person is, and whether or not I have their same ideology or whatever. If they have a trail that shows that they've been reflective in sort of AI work and able to break that down to multiple audiences, then it's someone that I'd be, potentially interested in working with or hiring. That said, in terms of the actual interest in working on issues of ethics and fairness in particular, we really see the interest mostly coming from people with historically discriminated against characteristics. So there seem to be a lot more women than men in a bunch of different circles, a lot more LGBTQ people than straight people in a lot of circles. You see a lot more Black people in the bias and fairness and ethics world than you do in sort of maybe an optimization world. And I think this reflects the fact that people in these with these different characteristics actually understand unfairness, actually understand discrimination in a way with people with more privileged characteristics don't. And so they tend to be more interested in working on it, not only because they have, maybe more of a personal response to it, but because they actually understand it at a deep analytical level in a way that I think people with more privileged characteristics don't. And so you do end up with people who are who might tend to skew blue just because they tend to be people who have historically had characteristics that have been discriminated against, and that just is kind of part and parcel of understanding justice and fairness.
It's funny, the Canadian in me heard skew blue, and our red and blue are backwards politically, so I had to do a double take there.
Oh, that's so funny.
So one thing that this does bring to mind as well is like, so these are very kind of present day concerns, right? We're talking about how we shape society today and so on. We've had a lot of episodes on the podcast where we talk about the very kind of futuristic concerns with AI, including AI alignment, AI safety, that sort of stuff. And I'd love to ask you this question because I've asked it to people in the alignment community, and some of them do seem to see this connection to ethics today. But is there a sense in which, like, as the technology keeps improving, as the challenges that we therefore have to face with these systems, the impact they can make increases, gradually AI ethics starts to merge with like AI safety even? Like we start to have to consider these things at the same time? Or do you think that these are going to be independent fields of study basically until we get to AGI type thing?
Oh no, that would be terrible. No, these are all intertwined, and I think that's a realization that people are coming to now who worked in fairness and are now realizing that there was something reasonable in saying ethics or responsible AI, because everything affects each other. And that goes back to the fractal problem too, right?
Right.
There's like so many different influences on so many different things. And so while you can sort of isolate something, it's a artificial isolation. You're pretending that all these other things don't exist in order to focus in on it. But when you're actually trying to solve the broader issues, you have to be able to bring in all the different kinds of variables at play. So yeah, I mean, that will include all the work that's being done in sort of like AI control, alignment, safety, privacy, security. All of these things come to bear on what it means to create more ethical or human aligned systems.
And actually, that complexity maybe has a circle back to the very beginning where you expressed some pessimism about sort of the future of the space. So I'd love to get from you a sense of like, what is it that's making you pessimistic right now, and what would have to change in order to change that pessimism?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess going back to a point I think I've made a few times now is around this like fundamental of inclusion. And the I had been hoping while working at Google that we were making some fundamental steps forward on inclusion. And why this was important at Google in particular is because it's a big tech company that has influence on the culture of a lot of other tech companies. There's a lot of sway, right? And so if we could do amazing at inclusion at Google, then there's hope that we could do well at inclusion within Silicon Valley or big tech companies or things like that. What ended up happening with Google is an example of the opposite of inclusion, of what it is to alienate people who have been through really hard experiences, to be very exclusive towards them, or to literally throw them out and smear them, not literally, figuratively. And so
You're referring here, I guess, to Timnit Gebru's situation, or?
right, yeah. So yeah, I guess I can briefly explain. So me and my co-lead Timnit Gebru were more or less happily working on AI ethics problems until suddenly someone high up just freaked out, it seems, and tossed her out. And then a few months later, tossed me out. And in both cases, they put forward statements that were misleading about what had actually happened that cast us in a negative light. And so when you're talking about inclusion, what you do is you take people with historically discriminated characteristics and you treasure that, right? you understand that if they're at the highest levels, of your research scientists at your company, at a big tech company, like they friggin' worked to get there, right? They've like overcome a lot of barriers and obstacles. And so it's useful to cherish that you finally have people at this level, who can do this work. And treat them like they belong, right? And so, but what you see coming out of Google was the opposite of that. This is what happens when inclusion is absolutely fundamentally not working. And so that fallout really darkened my view for the hope of AI in the future. I was really feeling like we were making progress in the understanding of inclusion and what inclusion is in tech. And we were being able to put out videos and do workshops and do all these kinds of things. Once Google sort of made the choices it did, or they did, I think it made it more clear that try as we might, at the end of the day, the real decision makers might not actually care. And if the decision makers might not actually care, then we're in a really tough problem in terms of evolving AI well in an inclusive way.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's one of those big kind of challenges of our day where people are arguing in every possible direction on this stuff. I mean, it becomes political so quickly. It's which is one of the scary things too about AI generally, is that it's so difficult because this is so impactful. This technology, it has such potential for changing our society, that a tweak in the algorithm here, a tweak in the algorithm there, and you're really reshaping social norms and political norms. Everybody feels like they need to have a skin in the game or a dog in the fight, so to speak. Do you have any thoughts about that aspect? Like, how do we avoid? Because politics is, notoriously, it's the mind killer. We all go into political mode. We lose touch with ourselves, and we tend to get more tribal, more insular, and so on. We have less compassion, less empathy. What do you think about that in the interaction between the kind of political level and then the hard technical work of like AI ethics?
Right. Well, so I think it's important to realize that technology is not apolitical. I think people have a sense that if they're not thinking about it, then it's not political. But not thinking about it does not mean that you're not making choices that will affect different people differently and provide some opportunities for people where it takes away opportunities for other, right? So every move we make in tech is fundamentally political. It's just that I think a lot of people don't think about it and then like to say that they're apolitical, as opposed to, maybe something that would be less nice, like perhaps ignorant. I have a video on that on my website where I kind of go off on that idea of tech being neutral. Uh, but anyway, yeah, I mean, you're bringing up a really good point about the sort of emotional response that people have in this space. And it's not just around sort of, I think maybe the sort of politics you're talking about, like maybe like Democrat, Republican kind of thing, but also around, the experiences of racism and things like that. So when you're working on technology where you're trying to minimize racist outcomes, you're affected by racism in a way that you're not affected by a loss function. When we're talking about this stuff, I think you said like tribal or something like this. There is a, fundamental, I'd say it's almost like instinctual reaction where to me, it feels like, your actions are being more controlled by your amygdala, the fight or flight, the very like base level understanding versus the frontal lobe, which is the more rational sort of, cautious sort of thinking. And when people are fighting and things like that, it's often driven by the amygdala. And that's why they say, like take a step back, breathe a few minutes, or, count to 10 in order to help like your frontal lobe rational sort of take over. But I feel like that really is what happens in a lot of the fairness and ethics work, is that it affects people so fundamentally that it's actually really hard to talk about it in a way that other problems aren't, because people are feeling it at their core and speaking from their core. So much more likely to get hurt, much more likely to be hurtful. And without really being clear about that and setting the stage in any conversation that really addresses this stuff, then you end up in really negative situations where it's not really possible to make good progress. And so, I mean, I think your point here is really astute and exactly one of the important ones to bring up, which is that working on this stuff is hard. It's hard emotionally. And we're not modeling that in our decisions now about structures around, AI governance and the development life cycle and stuff, because, tech and emotion generally aren't seen to go well hand in hand. But they have to in this case. You have to realize that this is something that really affects people, and they're going to be talking from that point of being affected. And that's going to change all of the discourse. It's going to change everything that happens, and that's going to change the ability to collaborate and things like that. And so, yeah, it is a serious, I wouldn't say it's a problem, but it's a factor that needs to be modeled in a way that it's not being modeled right now.
It's interesting how this advance of technology broadly, but AI specifically, is like kind of forcing us to almost resolve in some semi-permanent way a lot of the big philosophical quandaries we've been facing for the last like 10,000 years before, and it was nice in the year 1500 when a bunch of philosophers could just send letters to each other, batting around abstract ideas when the practical implementation of these ideas just wasn't on the table. But now it kind of feels like it's like, all right, look, we need an answer to punch into this thing, and now the stakes just feel like it's like the universe is checking our homework after 10,000 years. And
That's funny. I'm trying to think of who 1500 philosophers are. Is that like Boethius?
Now I get to show how few philosophers.
Yeah, I'm just like thinking like, who were the philosophers then? I mean, anyway, sorry.
I should have said 1700.
Oh, okay, I see. Yeah. I just know Boethius, who is from the, I guess, early 6th century. I don't know. Like, there's a gap in my knowledge in philosophy until about like 1600, 1700.
I don't know. Epicurus, and then there's a bunch of Roman emperors.
Yeah, exactly. I lost track. And then the Enlightenment.
Yeah. It just comes out of nowhere. Nothing happened during the day.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate you sharing your insights, Margaret, on such a complicated topic, too. I mean, it really is. It's the human side of AI. It's inescapable. We're all going to have to deal with it sooner or later, and we already are, actually, in various ways. So thank you for your time. I'm really glad you stopped by for this.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And thanks for the awesome questions.